In the summer of 1683, a grim spectacle unfolded on Tower Hill in London. Before an eager and jeering crowd, Lord William Russell knelt, his hands bound, his face both pale and defiant. He had been accused of treason against King Charles II. His executioner, Jack Ketch, stood nearby, gripping a massive axe, the weapon that would carry out the king's justice. With a loud thud, the axe swung, but the strike missed its mark. Russell let out a blood-curdling scream, while the crowd watched in horrified silence. Ketch lifted the axe again, and with another swing, blood spurted, but still the head remained attached. After 3 more agonizing blows, Russell's body finally fell limp, his head severed at last. Ketch wiped the blood from his hands, unfazed, knowing that his grim task was far from over. In medieval society, executioners held a position of both fear and necessity. These men who wielded the power of life and death were often seen as both brutal and vital to functioning of justice, though the question remains, were they cold-hearted killers, or just fulfilling the societal duties thrust upon them? In an age when the line between punishment and spectacle often blurred, they were men who lived in the shadows of public disdain, but were essential to the operation of the state. Before executioners became an official role, there was only vengeance. In ancient times, justice wasn't a function of government, but a personal affair, one where families sought revenge for deaths, often leading to cycles of violence that could last for generations. As civilizations grew, so did the need for order. Monarchs and rulers realized that if they allowed blood feuds to continue, chaos would reign. Thus, they took on the responsibility of deciding who would live and who would die. Public executions were not just about delivering punishment. They were designed to instill fear and maintain control. Traitors, thieves, and murderers didn't just face execution. Their deaths were meant to be a public display that showed the power of the crown. Punishments had to be slow, painful, and highly visible to send a message. It wasn't enough to execute criminals. They had to serve as examples. These executions became more than acts of justice. They were performances, often attended by large crowds eager for a spectacle. The executioner, in this case, became not only a bringer of death, but a performer. The crowds were ravenous for blood, and the executioner's skill determined whether they would receive the swift release of death or the agonizing prolongation of suffering. A clean and efficient execution earned respect. But botched job, like the one with Russell, would leave the crowd in outrage, blaming the executioner for the failure to give them the show they expected. Being an executioner was no ordinary profession. It wasn't a job that many aspired to. In fact, it was one often thrust upon those who had no other choice. Some were criminals themselves, given the option of taking on the gruesome work or facing death on the scaffold. Others inherited the role from their fathers, with family names tied forever to the grim task. And some, surprisingly, took the job willingly, attracted by the steady income despite the dishonor that came with it. As public executions grew in popularity, the role of the executioner became a matter of skill, often passed down through generations. Young apprentices learned the trade at their father's side, mastering every method of punishment. One mistake could mean death, not only for the condemned, but for the man holding the axe as well. The executioner had to be precise. An executioner's reputation was built on how cleanly and efficiently they carried out their task. Take, for example, the infamous Jack Ketch, the English executioner who became notorious not for his skill, but for his cruelty and incompetence. He botched many executions, but the one that gained the most notoriety was the beheading of the Duke of Monmouth, James Scott, in 1685. The first swing missed entirely, and it took several more before the job was finally done. The crowd, stunned by the brutality of it all, could only watch in horror as the Duke suffered. Executioners like Ketch were often only as good as their tools. A swift beheading required a skilled hand and a sharp blade, but when tools failed, it led to a grisly and drawn-out death. The axe, sword, and even more gruesome devices like the breaking wheel were not just tools of death. They were symbols of power, control, and fear. The executioner wasn't merely a functionary of the law. They were a living symbol of fate and punishment. Yet, despite their essential role, executioners were never truly embraced by society. They were outcasts, feared, and despised. But the paradox was clear. Despite being shunned, they were also revered in their own twisted way. They held a strange power over life and death, and for many, the spectacle of a public execution was more about the show than the justice it supposedly delivered. So, what drove these men to become executioners? Perhaps it was the power, the fear, or the steady income. Whatever the reason, they became symbols of the brutal, uncompromising justice of the medieval world, a world where death was not just an end, but a statement. And for those who stood on the scaffold, it was a reminder that in this world, defiance would not go unpunished. In the past, death took on even more brutal forms. One of the most infamous tools used by executioners was a gallows, a simple rope, yet capable of ending a life in an instant, if done correctly. A swift drop could break a neck, but many hangings weren't so quick. Sometimes, if the drop was too short, the condemned would strangle slowly, kicking their legs in the air, desperately trying to draw a breath. A skilled executioner knew how to manage the rope's slack, but mistakes were frequent. In these cases, it could take minutes, sometimes even an hour, for the prisoner to die. Then there was the dreaded breaking wheel, one of the cruelest methods of execution. Unlike beheading or hanging, this tool wasn't designed for a swift death. It was designed for excruciating pain. The condemned would be strapped to a massive wooden wheel, their limbs splayed out. The executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar, would smash their arms and legs one by one, shattering bones while the victim remained alive, writhing in agony. In some cases, a final blow to the chest would end their suffering, but more often, they were left to die slowly, their broken bodies on display for days as a grim reminder of justice. But perhaps the most infamous of all punishments was reserved for those accused of treason. Hanging, drawing, and quartering became a symbol of the darkest form of retribution. But even these methods of torture and execution would eventually evolve, and with the dawn of the French Revolution, a new tool would change everything: the guillotine. This device didn't require a skilled hand, just gravity. In less than a second, the blade would drop, and the condemned would be dead. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner of Paris, became renowned for performing thousands of executions with the guillotine, including the beheadings of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. It said that even royalty, in their final moments, looked up at the falling blade with the same terror as any common criminal. For centuries, execution tools such as these determined the course of justice, deciding not only who lived and who died, but also how much suffering they endured in the process. Despite the growing efficiency of these methods, the role of the executioner remained unchanged. He was the final agent of the law, the one who transformed sentences into a grim reality. And yet, no matter how skilled an executioner was or how necessary his role was, society never fully accepted him. Executioners lived in the shadows, feared and shunned. People needed them to carry out justice. But once the blood was clean from the scaffold, they would keep their distance. In many cities, executioners were forced to live outside the walls, their homes built on the edges of society. Some towns even barred them from entering churches, and their families carried the stigma of their work for generations. To protect themselves, many executioners wore masks or hoods to conceal their identities, hiding not only their faces but also their dignity. Yet, despite being outcasts, executioners had certain privileges. Many were paid well, often far more than the average laborer. Some even received land and property in exchange for their services, living in isolation, but never in poverty. Charles-Henri Sanson, despite his efficiency and skill, was never fully accepted by society. His family had been executioners for generations, and while he was respected for the work he did, he was always considered untouchable. His hands had taken too many lives, and even as he carried out thousands of executions, including the beheading of King, he remained an outcast, seen as a necessary evil. The role of the executioner was a strange contradiction. He was both an instrument of justice and a constant reminder of death. Society needed him, but it never embraced him. For many, the only way to escape the stigma of their profession was to pass it on to their sons, ensuring that the blood-soaked tradition would continue for another generation. Executions were not just punishments, they were public performances. Often, before the blade fell, the condemned were paraded through the streets, forced to walk their final path while the crowd jeered and cursed. Some prisoners were given the chance to offer a final confession. their last words intended to cleanse their soul before death. For others, that mercy was denied. The executioner, following strict customs, sometimes asked for forgiveness from the condemned before carrying out the sentence. It was a hollow gesture, rarely offering any comfort. The audience played its part too. They cheered, gasped, and sometimes even begged for mercy, but most of the time, they simply watched. Once the execution was over, and the body was discarded or put on display, the crowd would move on, already waiting for the next show. But for the executioner, the spectacle never ended. He would clean his tools, wash the blood from his hands, and prepare for the next name on the list. His work was far from over because as long as there were crimes, betrayals, and rulers needing vengeance, the executioner's job would never end. For centuries, executioners stood at the intersection of justice and cruelty. They were both feared and necessary. They were outcasts, yet their work shaped history. They were the final hand of the law, the enforcers of punishment. Without them, laws had no teeth, and power had no consequences. Despite being despised, executioners ensured that justice was carried out. But were they true servants of justice, or simply merchants of death? Some, like Franz Schmidt, believed in fairness and justice. Others, like Jack Catch, reveled in their power, dragging out executions in sadistic displays of incompetence. Then there were men like Charles Henri Sanson, who executed thousands in the name of revolution, including the very king he once served. Executioners were both feared and needed, despised yet indispensable. They lived on the fringes of society, but their hands shaped the course of history. As society evolved, so did their role. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the public executioner became a faceless government official, performing their grim duties behind closed doors. And then, as societies moved away from capital punishment, the profession gradually disappeared. The scaffold was abandoned, the axe put away, and the last generations of executioners faded into history. Yet, the legacy of their work endures. Their names may be forgotten, but the mark they left on history will never be erased. What do you think? Were these men truly believing in their work, or did they simply accept the burden because it was the only path left to them? If you lived during those times, could you have done their job? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you want to uncover more of history's darkest professions, subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories of nefarious deeds throughout time.